Here's what I think. I think whether it's Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, Axl Rose and Slash, John Bon Jovi and Richie Sambora, who always hated each other on a certain level.
John and Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. Right back to John and Paul from the Beatles. You know, it is complicated, but like all peace treaties, you know, the only way it's going to happen is to say we just can't take care of all these things. We're going to get back together, and then it's up to the rest of you to make this work. We love you, we care about you, but we cannot make a decision on our career based on who you married or who you love or what your job is right now. It's all going to change.
Yes.
And we don't want to lose any of you, but it's up to you. You can't be sucking off my tit for the rest of my life. We're getting back together with Fish, and it's going to be amazing. Now, do you want to join us?
Do you believe it? Or is it a phantasm or what?
No, I think it's half fantasy, half opportunity, because in my opinion, Fish would do it in a second. I think Mark Kelly would do it in a second. I think Steve Rothery is far less certain, because ultimately Steve Rothery and Fish were the yin and yang of Marillion.
Yeah.
Steve really was the one that came up with the music, and Fish was the one that came up with the words. And
both together is absolutely magical.
But they're opposites. You know, Fish is this very charismatic, fiery, big, bold character, particularly when he was young in the 80s. Yeah. Steve is the opposite. Fish is fire, Steve is ice. You know, he's more contained, he's more considered. But what they say about opposites is true. They attract. And when it works, when that yin-yang works, it makes the best music Marillion have ever made in a way that they simply cannot manage without Fish. But unfortunately, when it doesn't work, they're like a ship missing its re-entry point into Earth. It just spins off. I went, oh, Lady Nina, it's a fantastic single.
Awesome.
Yeah, well, I just thought it was fantastic. And they went, no, it's the other one. I went, the other one, play it again. So we listened, and I thought, Can I just say, that was on first hearing. I mean, they totally made the right choice. Lady Nina is a great B-side, in my opinion. Yeah. But it's not a big album track. It wasn't. No. Kaylee is a huge, wonderful Marillion track. They really should have made more songs like that, and I'm sure they would have done if Fish hadn't left. One of his great strengths in the early days, but also the thing that kind of became his undoing as the years went by, was he took things always very, very personally. So if somebody gave a bad review to the group, you know, he would ring them up or he would confront them when he met them. When it came to the fans, he took great care, because they started with no fans, and then they have one or two. And of course, when a show is finished, particularly when you're a young band, you're playing a small venue, you can practically shake hands with the crowd. You know, you're that close. Your connection is that intimate. You also see the same faces turning up at different shows. It's not like you have 100 fans in each venue. It's that you have these 40 or 50 fans that go to all of them. So he just instinctually, there was no model for it in those days, but he instinctually grasped the fact that the key relationship that would help the band grow in terms of their career was the fans. They are absolutely the most important people. They were also uniquely, in Marillion's case, unlike, we have to remember Marillion came along at a time when Duran Duran are just making their first mark, when Spandau Ballet are just making their first mark. This whole realm was about connecting with the music press, was about being on the cover of magazines, was about being a media sensation. And Marillion were none of those things and had no shot at being any of those things. They were probably the most unfashionable band in the world as far as the music critics were concerned. The only people that really believed in what they did were the fans. So very, very early on, you have this incredibly strong connection. And because we've also gone through very recently in those times the punk scene, where fanzines essentially were the social media of their day. You know, these days you can put your group on Facebook or YouTube, or there are lots of ways you can put your stuff out there on the internet and people can connect with you. In those days, of course, there wasn't any of that. But there were these things called fanzines that existed independently of the music press, independently of the radio. You know, we had in Britain, we had one national pop music station, and they would only play album kind of stuff in the evenings.
Mix 96.
Absolutely, and no television as such, unless you're on Top of the Pops, or there was an album show called Old Grey Whistle Test. But you had to have an album out. They didn't have a record deal. They just had the fans. And of course, what we mustn't forget, and this was the genius that Fish brought to the group. He was brilliant on stage. He was brilliant, not just at connecting with the fans off stage and through fanzines and phone calls and regular contact and building a network so that people knew when they would be playing next and all that stuff. On stage, he just was the ringmaster. These complicated songs became sing-alongs. He was able to lift that crowd and not going to say control it, not so much control it as help build it, help manicure the whole atmosphere into really something very extraordinary, so that by the time record companies did start coming around, they would walk into this incredible event where people are going nuts. They're not just going, wow, that's cool. You know, they're going, yeah, and they're singing all the songs and they know all the material intimately. And it became a kind of a no-brainer. You realise that the minute this group releases a record, there's a lot of people going to buy this, which is exactly what happened with the first album. It went straight into the charts at number 7, I think, something like that. Yeah. I mean, in those days when people bought records and you had to... These days, you can sell a few records to your family and you'll go in at number 7, you know. In those days, you literally had to sell thousands and thousands. And they did it without any support from anywhere other than the fans. I totally understand. I actually worked for Marillion for a short time in 1998 as their PR. And at that stage, they had come out of their deal with EMI. They briefly had a deal with Sanctuary, which is when I was working for them. And then almost immediately after that, they got very directly involved in what they call pre-order, but these days we know better as crowdfunding. And the reason for that was entirely logical, although very daring for the time. And that was because of this very unique relationship they had always had with their fans. You know, even when they were having huge hit singles like Kaylee and Incommunicado and big albums, Clutching at Straws, Misplaced, they were never quite fashionable. They were never in the mainstream entirely. They always played by their own rules. And that was fine while their career was doing this and they were selling more and more records. After Fish leaves, their career in terms of sales starts to plateau. Yeah. And that's no good to a major label like EMI. It's a bit like when a patient has a chronic illness, a doctor in a hospital, it's no good to him because he can't just fix you. If it's something you're going to have to manage long term, you need to seek help from somewhere else. Marillion's career had plateaued. They clearly had a huge fan base, but the momentum was now becoming dissipated. So rather than renew their contract with EMI, they went first of all to Sanctuary, who was an independent situation. They would get a bigger say in what they did, bigger cut of the royalties. It was kind of a halfway house towards where they are now. And that was okay. But it was it fell between two stools. It wasn't as dynamic as being with a major label. So although they had much more input and control, they didn't have the powerhouse of a major label. So they're thinking, well, what's the point? And the internet at this point is just about to go 2.0. It hasn't quite, but it's just about to. But what is happening is we've got this huge moment in history when websites and net companies and .com businesses are suddenly where it's at. And they kind of connected the points. Mark Kelly in particularly, and said, listen, how about we put our own records out? And that was like, okay, but how do we do that? How do we, because in those days, it still cost a lot of money to record an album, to hire a studio, all that stuff. And eventually they hit upon this, what seemed a pretty crazy idea at the time, like, we'll ask the fans for the money. And it seemed a desperate move, I'll be honest with you. When at the time when I learned this was going on, I went, ouch. I mean, maybe this will work once. But, you know, in fact, it became one of the big major successes of their career. It became a huge turning point in their story. And in fact, it drew a whole new business model for the way that now, 10, 15 years later, pretty much every smart cookie in the business, not just in music, but in books, film, any artistic endeavor, you go to your potential audience and you say, this is what we're thinking of doing. Would you like to be involved? Would you like to contribute? And of course, there's a great exhilaration for a fan, particularly in those days, a Marillion fan who's got a very long relationship with the group. Yeah. Now they can be even closer to the group. So it wasn't just a case of putting up some money. It was a much more intimate way of connecting with the group. You're part of the creative process suddenly. You're helping them make their music. And they kind of had a brilliant idea and then stumbled through the rest of it, realizing what we all now take for granted, which is that actually social media, the internet, crowdfunding, all these things which we now see as part of our day-to-day lives, they were like the first men in space. You know, they were drawing the maps that everybody else followed. They were making up the rules. They didn't know if they would survive. They were pioneers, and they risked everything. And the wonderful part is they did succeed, and in fact, it brought them a new momentum. So suddenly they're completely in control of their careers, their lives, and they're able to make these very daring, high-end production albums that they absolutely would not have been able to in any other circumstance. And we see this whole exciting new realm in the Marillion story emerge, and it's just a fantastic thing. I think it's unique in music. There isn't really anybody else. You know, Radiohead put out an album for free. Yeah, but they're tinkering with it.
In 1982.
Absolutely. I mean, it kind of connected back to there were lots of failures in this area, but Marillion made it happen. I think the other thing you have to remember is when you risk your life on something, you got to make it happen. And they had to. They weren't messing around. You know, they put all the chips on the table and they made it happen. I personally think Fish has made some very poor choices in his career. He's tried to go on his own in the same way Marillion have, but he hasn't really succeeded. And I think the difficulty for him has been that he's just got himself. You know, everybody that works with Fish works for Fish. Yeah. He's paying them. They are
teamwork.
It's not. Yeah, their whole trip is tethered to his whims. He hasn't sung in Marillion for 30 years, and people go, "Yeah. So are they still going?" Yeah. You go, "No, there's this guy Steve Hogarth. He's made tremendous records with them." Who cares? You know. Yeah. But so I think Marillion have made great choices. I think they've made tremendous music, and they've stayed very, very strong. But I think Fish has been left to his own devices. You know, early on when he had momentum in his career and he made that album of covers, bad choice. Bad choice. Or if you're going to do it, do covers that your fan base are going to relate to. Fish doing a T-Rex song, you know, just it didn't work. You know, the Sandy Denis song was great. There were some other things he did which were great. But he was indulging his fantasy. He'd wanted to do an album like that back in Marillion days. They'd gone, and they were right. But I think he hasn't had the benefit of that.
Yeah.
You know, Fish has been knocking on their door for years. Fish has offered to do shows where he comes on and does a solo set. They come on with Hogarth, and then they all finish together. And of course, Hogarth's like, no way. Because talented as he is, and he's very talented, great singer, great writer, he's never, ever going to be Fish. And he knows, he's no fool. He sees the audience reaction when they play an old Marillion song. It's interesting to me, I mean, Marillion have made some very, very good albums with Steve Hogarth. But it's interesting to me that still of that catalogue, the songs that the crowd always react best to are things like Easter and stuff that came right in the Fish era. Season's End, you know, could have been an album with Fish to a degree, in the same way that Vigil in a Wilderness of Mirrors could have been a Marillion album, you know.
Yeah.
So I think they've in the publishing world, we call it diluting the product. You know, if I put out a book on Marillion today, and you put out a book on Fish the same day, instead of everybody going, oh, I've got to get that book on Marillion, or I've got to get that book on Fish, they go, I don't know what I want. But if you had one book with them both in, you go, it's a no-brainer. If there was an album tomorrow that was the reformed Marillion with Fish, oh, these days it would go straight to #1 in Britain. It would be a big seller in Canada. It would be a big seller in Germany.
The return of this play show and the success.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if musically is the creatively how can it's possible, but
I tell you what else. The last time I saw Marillion play with Steve Hogarth in London was at a place called the Town and Country Club, which is a lovely venue, stand-up venue, lots of bars, end of year, really crowded, wonderful atmosphere. Holds about 1,500 people, maybe 2,000. Marillion and Fish get back together tomorrow. They could do multiple nights at Wembley Arena, the O2, NEC, you know, they could do festivals, they could be, you know, everybody would want them. Everybody would want them. And if the album was good, then they would have another 10 years on their career where people are suddenly really interested in them again.
Right.
And they're having hit records and they're viral and everybody cares. All great rock bands have a narrative, you know, and the greatest ones start out here on the edge of the extremes, just like Marillion did, just like all the great bands do. They start out here, and as their career progresses, they get closer to the centre because people start to get them more, they get better at what they do, and they reach a kind of critical mass if they just stay on course. Marillion blew up the whole ship. You know, when Fish left, the spaceship crashed. And what they've done with the crowdfunding and with Steve Hogarth is extremely commendable. I mean, it's brave, it's risky. Yeah. They've absolutely pulled it from the fire, and they've done a brilliant job. But there's, in a parallel universe somewhere, Fish didn't leave, and they are now Pink Floyd.